Marcus Johnson had always believed that dreams were built one small step at a time. Growing up in a busy neighborhood in Atlanta, he often imagined himself living somewhere peaceful, away from the constant traffic, loud sirens, and endless rush. His favorite memory as a child was a single weekend trip his parents had taken him on a quiet lakeside cabin where he spent an entire afternoon fishing with his father and listening to the soft ripples of water against the shore. That weekend stayed with him for years, and he promised himself that one day, he would own a place like that. By the time Marcus turned 35, life had started to settle. He worked as a software engineer for a mid-sized tech company, and while the job was demanding, it paid well enough to allow him to save. Unlike many of his friends, Marcus wasn't interested in fancy cars or flashy vacations. Instead, he quietly set aside a portion of his salary every month, dreaming of the day he could buy his little escape from the city. After nearly 8 years of saving, researching, and patiently searching, Marcus finally found a small but beautiful lake cabin tucked away inside a gated community called Lakeshore Haven. It wasn't a big house, but it didn't need to be. The cabin had a charming wooden porch, a single bedroom, a cozy fireplace, and a breathtaking view of the lake. The first time Marcus stood on the deck and watched the sunlight dance across the water, he knew he had found his sanctuary. The process of buying the cabin wasn't easy. The community was run by a strict homeowners association, or HOA, which controlled everything from landscaping rules to property colors. But Marcus didn't mind. He signed the papers, followed every guideline, and became an official member of the community. At first, life in Lakeshore Haven was everything Marcus had hoped for. Mornings were peaceful, filled with birdsong and the gentle rustling of leaves. He would make a fresh cup of coffee, sit on the porch, and watch the mist roll off the lake as the sun rose. Evenings were calm and quiet, the perfect escape after long days spent coding and troubleshooting at work. But it wasn't long before Marcus noticed something unusual about the way the community operated. Almost everything seemed to run through one person, Karen Whitmore. She was the president of the HOA, a position she had apparently held for over a decade. At first glance, Karen seemed polite, always smiling at new residents and introducing herself warmly. But Marcus soon learned that most neighbors referred to her, quietly and cautiously, as Madam President. Karen had a way of making her presence felt everywhere. If someone left their trash can out a few hours late, they'd get a notice. If a lawn wasn't trimmed to the precise HOA-approved length, there would be a warning letter. If a house's paint shade didn't perfectly match the community palette, Karen would personally knock on doors to remind homeowners about the rules. Marcus wasn't one to cause trouble, so he kept his head down and followed every guideline to the letter. He repainted the porch when she suggested a different shade. He trimmed his hedges exactly to regulation height. He even switched out his outdoor light bulbs because Karen claimed his warm white bulbs clashed with the uniform look of the neighborhood. Still, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Karen didn't quite approve of him. Whenever they crossed paths at HOA meetings or while walking through the neighborhood, her smiles felt forced. She was overly friendly with some residents, especially her friends and relatives who also lived in the community, but strangely cold and distant toward him. He brushed it off, telling himself not to overthink it. After all, he had what he wanted, peace and quiet by the lake. For the next year, Marcus spent most of his weekends fixing up the cabin. He built a small wooden dock for fishing, planted a neat row of azaleas by the porch, and even restored the old stone pathway leading to the lake front. Neighbors would occasionally stop by and compliment his hard work, and Marcus enjoyed their company. That's when he began to hear little whispers. Over backyard chats and casual evening strolls, residents would mention odd stories about Karen and the HOA. One elderly couple confided that a neighbor once lost a small storage shed after Karen declared it was built too close to the property line. Another man complained that Karen had fined him hundreds of dollars for having non-approved curtains visible from the outside. Marcus listened carefully but tried not to get involved. "As long as I follow the rules," he told himself, there won't be any problems. But that belief wouldn't last long. One sunny Saturday morning, Marcus was on his porch sipping coffee when he noticed a young man inspecting the property line near his cabin. The stranger had a clipboard, a rolled-up set of papers, and a measuring tape. Marcus walked over and introduced himself politely. "Morning," he said. "I'm Marcus, I own this cabin. Can I help you with something?" The young man smiled awkwardly. "Oh, I'm Chad," he said. "Just checking a few measurements. My mom asked me to." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Your mom?" "Yeah," Chad replied casually. "Karen Whitmore, HOA president." Marcus forced a polite smile and nodded. "All right. Well, if you need any details about this property, I've got all my purchase records." Chad just shrugged and walked away. Something about the encounter unsettled Marcus. Why would Karen's son be measuring anything near his property? He checked his mailbox that afternoon, half expecting an official HOA letter, but there was nothing. Weeks passed, and Marcus tried to forget about it. He focused on his work, enjoyed the lake, and continued improving the cabin. Life was good, or so he thought. Everything changed one Friday evening when he came home to find a large envelope taped to his front door. The bold header on the first page read, "Property Boundary Adjustment Notice." Marcus sat down at his kitchen table and read every word carefully. According to the document, the HOA had conducted a compliance review and determined that part of his cabin's structure encroached on common property. As a result, the HOA had reassigned ownership of his cabin to another resident, someone named Chad Whitmore. For a moment, Marcus just sat there in silence, rereading the letter again and again. It didn't make sense. He had bought this cabin legally. He had the deed. He had paid every HOA fee on time. How could they just give his property to someone else, and to the HOA president's son, no less? His peaceful lakeside dream had just taken an unexpected turn. Marcus sat at his kitchen table, holding the letter in his hands, feeling his heartbeat grow heavier with every passing second. The words blurred as he read them again and again, hoping somehow he had misunderstood. But no matter how many times he read them, the meaning stayed the same. The HOA was claiming that his cabin, his dream, his sanctuary, no longer belonged to him. For several minutes, Marcus just stared at the walls around him. Every corner of the cabin told a story: the small rug his mother had gifted him, the dock he had spent 3 weekends building, the flowers he had carefully planted along the porch. This wasn't just a piece of property. It was his safe space, his reward for years of hard work and sacrifice. How could anyone simply take that away? He took a deep breath and set the letter down, forcing himself to stay calm. "There has to be a mistake," he whispered to himself. "This can't be real." Marcus opened his laptop and immediately searched through his files. He pulled up the deed, the title documents, and every payment receipt he had from the day he purchased the cabin. Everything was in order. There was nothing missing, nothing unusual. He had followed every law, every guideline, every HOA rule. He decided to call the HOA office the next morning to clear things up. The next day, Marcus dialed the number listed on the HOA letter. After 3 rings, a cheerful automated voice answered, "Thank you for calling Lakeshore Haven HOA. Please hold while we connect you." Soft background music played as Marcus waited. After a few minutes, a woman picked up the call. "Lakeshore Haven HOA office," she said briskly. "How can I help you?" "Hi," Marcus replied politely. "This is Marcus Johnson, owner of Cabin 14 by the lake. I received a letter yesterday about a so-called boundary adjustment, and I believe there's been some mistake." The woman paused for a moment before answering. "Oh, yes. I see your file here. The board conducted a property review last month and determined that your cabin sits on HOA-controlled land. Ownership has been reassigned." Marcus frowned. "With respect, that's impossible. I bought this cabin legally. I have the deed. I've paid every HOA fee on time. How can you reassign property that isn't yours? I understand your concern, she said flatly, but the board's decision is final. If you'd like, you can file a formal appeal. It'll be reviewed during the next quarterly meeting. When's that? Marcus asked. In about 4 months, she replied casually, as if she were talking about a simple scheduling conflict. Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. So, until then, what happens to my cabin? There was a pause on the other end. Technically, it's now under the Whitmore file. You'll need to vacate before the end of the month. Marcus felt his stomach twist. Vacate? You're asking me to leave my own home? Sir, those are the board's instructions. You can submit your appeal in writing if you disagree, the woman said curtly before hanging up. Marcus sat there in stunned silence, the dial tone buzzing in his ear. That evening, he walked outside to clear his mind. The lake was as calm as ever, its glassy surface reflecting the fading light of dusk. It seemed impossible that while the world around him remained peaceful, his life had been turned upside down. A couple of neighbors walked by and greeted him. Marcus forced a smile, but one of them, Mr. Turner, who lived 2 cabins down, noticed something was wrong. You look worried, Marcus, Mr. Turner said gently. Everything all right? Marcus hesitated, then explained about the letter. The older man sighed deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. I was afraid this might happen one day, he said quietly. What do you mean? Marcus asked. Mr. Turner glanced around as if checking to make sure no one was listening. You're not the first. Karen's been doing this for years. Her son Chad has somehow acquired 3 other cabins in this community, always after some so-called boundary adjustment. The HOA claims it's just paperwork, but everyone knows what's really going on. Marcus felt a mix of shock and frustration. Why hasn't anyone stopped her? People tried, Mr. Turner said softly. But Karen's been running this HOA for so long, she practically controls it. Whenever someone fights back, she buries them in paperwork and fines. Most people give up before they get anywhere. But this is theft, Marcus whispered, still struggling to process the situation. Mr. Turner nodded. It is. But no one's been willing to stand up to her. Marcus took a deep breath, staring out at the lake. For the first time since moving here, the peaceful view didn't comfort him. It only reminded him of what he stood to lose. Over the next few days, Marcus couldn't focus on anything else. He reread his documents, made copies of every form he had signed, and began organizing them into neat folders. If Karen and the HOA thought they could scare him into leaving quietly, they were mistaken. He tried calling the HOA again, but his calls were ignored. Emails went unanswered. When he showed up at the HOA office in person, the receptionist told him politely but firmly that Karen was unavailable. On his way out, Marcus spotted Chad in the hallway, casually laughing with another board member. Chad noticed him, smirked slightly, and walked away without saying a word. That small gesture told Marcus everything he needed to know. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. One evening, Marcus decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting in person. He walked into the community hall and found Karen sitting at the head of the table, smiling as she greeted board members and her close friends. When Marcus approached, her expression shifted to a tight, polite grin. Marcus, she said, tilting her head slightly. How can we help you today? I'd like to talk about my cabin, he said calmly, though inside his heart was pounding. I received a letter saying ownership has been reassigned. There must be a mistake. Karen folded her hands neatly on the table. There's no mistake, she said sweetly. The board reviewed property lines, and unfortunately, part of your structure sits on common HOA land. To maintain fairness, we reassign the property. Fairness. Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. You reassigned my legally purchased property to your son. A hush fell over the room. A few board members exchanged awkward glances. Karen smiled faintly. Chad happened to be next in line for lake access. It's within our rights as outlined in the HOA charter. Marcus pulled out his folder and set it on the table. I have the deed, Karen. The land, the cabin, everything on it's mine. You can't just take it away because you feel like it? Karen's smile faltered, but only for a moment. If you disagree, you're welcome to file a formal appeal, she said smoothly. Until then, I suggest you prepare to vacate. Marcus stood there for a moment, staring at her calm, composed face. Around the table, no one spoke up. It was clear everyone knew what was happening, but no one wanted to challenge her. Finally, Marcus gathered his documents, nodded politely, and walked out. That night, he sat on his porch, staring at the quiet lake under the silver glow of the moon. He thought about the years he spent saving for this dream. He thought about his parents, who had always taught him to work hard and play by the rules. He thought about the peace he had found here, the mornings on the porch, the sound of birdsong, the way the mist rose over the water. And then he thought about losing it all because of someone else's greed. No. He wasn't going to let that happen. This wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about principle. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and followed every rule. He wasn't going to walk away quietly. Marcus didn't know exactly how yet, but one thing was certain, he was going to fight back. Marcus woke up the next morning with a new sense of determination. The fear and shock he had felt were still there, but they were no longer in control. Instead, there was something stronger growing inside him, a quiet but steady resolve. This was not going to end with him packing up boxes and walking away from his dream cabin. He had worked too hard for this. He had followed every rule, paid every fee, and respected every guideline. If the HOA thought they could take advantage of him, they had chosen the wrong person. The first thing Marcus did was gather every single document he had related to the cabin. He spent the entire morning at his dining table, carefully organizing papers into neat stacks, the original deed showing his legal ownership, the title documents signed at the time of purchase, payment receipts for every HOA fee he'd ever made, copies of community maps showing his property boundaries. As he went through the paperwork, Marcus realized something important. Nowhere in any of his purchase documents was there any mention of shared land or conditional ownership. Everything stated clearly that the cabin and the land beneath it belonged to him, no exceptions. That was his first piece of solid evidence. But Marcus knew documents alone wouldn't be enough. If Karen had been pulling these kinds of tricks for years, she must have had a system in place. He needed to understand exactly how she had managed to take over other properties in the past. So, over the next few days, Marcus started talking to his neighbors. It wasn't easy. Most people in Lakeshore Haven were polite but cautious, and when the subject of the HOA came up, many lowered their voices or quickly changed the topic. But slowly, Marcus earned their trust. One afternoon, he visited Mr. and Mrs. Turner, the elderly couple who had warned him earlier. Over tea, they told him their story. A few years ago, Mrs. Turner explained softly, our neighbor had a small storage shed in his backyard. One day, the HOA declared it was built too close to the property line and ordered it removed. He fought back, but within weeks, he was flooded with fines for all sorts of minor things: untrimmed hedges, incorrect mailbox color, you name it. Eventually, he gave up and moved away. Guess who ended up with his property? Marcus nodded slowly. Chad, he guessed. Mr. Turner confirmed with a tired sigh. That's right. Every time someone gives up, somehow Chad ends up benefiting. No one ever says anything openly, but everyone knows. Another neighbor, a young mother named Rachel, shared a similar experience. She had once questioned a small HOA fee increase, and the very next month, she started receiving notices claiming she had non-approved patio furniture. "They made my life miserable until I stopped asking questions," Rachel admitted. The more Marcus listened, the clearer the pattern became. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was using them. Every little regulation, every vague clause in the HOA handbook, every bit of authority the board held, she had turned them into tools to pressure residents, wear them down, and, in some cases, take what she wanted. Marcus left each conversation more convinced than ever, if he wanted justice, he couldn't rely on the HOA to play fair. He needed outside help. The next morning, Marcus called a local real estate attorney named Daniel Harris. Daniel was calm, professional, and to Marcus's relief already familiar with Lakeshore Haven's HOA. "You're not the first person to call me about them," Daniel said over the phone. "I've had several clients complain about how they operate. I can't promise an overnight fix, but if you've got clear ownership documents, we have a strong case." Marcus met with Daniel that same afternoon. Together, they went through the cabin's purchase history, HOA bylaws, and the reassignment letter. Daniel frowned as he read through the document. "This doesn't hold up legally," he explained. "The HOA doesn't have the authority to reassign property you own outright. At most, they can fine you for rule violations, but taking your entire cabin and giving it to someone else? No way. This won't stand in court." For the first time in weeks, Marcus felt a small spark of hope. Daniel advised him to document everything, every letter, every ignored email, every unanswered phone call. He also suggested Marcus request all HOA meeting notes and financial statements through a formal written request. "Paper trails don't lie," Daniel said. "If they've been abusing their power, we'll find it." Over the following weeks, Marcus became almost like a private investigator. Every morning before work, he drafted letters to the HOA requesting copies of property maps, meeting minutes, and financial reports. He sent every request by certified mail so there would be a record. He also started taking photographs of his cabin, property lines, and dock from every angle just in case Karen tried to claim something else. At night, he researched HOA laws online, reading about similar cases where homeowners fought back against overreaching associations. He learned about state statutes protecting property rights and found examples of other residents who had won lawsuits against unfair HOA practices. The more he learned, the stronger his resolve became. Still, Marcus understood that fighting Karen openly would be risky. She had influence, allies, and control over the HOA board. So, he decided to stay quiet at least for now. To everyone else, it looked like Marcus was calmly preparing to leave. But behind the scenes, he was building a case, brick by brick. One evening, while walking back from the lake, Marcus spotted Chad talking with two other board members near the HOA office. They were laughing and pointing toward his cabin. Marcus stayed out of sight but quietly listened from a distance. "Mom says we should have everything signed off by next month," Chad was saying. "Once that's done, we'll finally get the dock too." One of the board members chuckled. "That guy doesn't stand a chance. Nobody ever fights the HOA." Marcus walked away without confronting them, but their words only strengthened his determination. "They don't think I'll fight," he thought to himself. Good. They won't see it coming. A few days later, Marcus received another letter from the HOA, this time warning him that he was trespassing on HOA-controlled property and needed to vacate immediately. Instead of panicking, Marcus calmly added the letter to his growing file of evidence. Then he called Daniel. "This is exactly what we needed," Daniel said confidently. "They're overstepping their authority even more now. It'll help us in court." But Marcus wasn't just preparing for legal action, he had something bolder in mind. If Karen and the HOA thought they could push him out, he was going to make staying impossible for them, too. Over the next several weekends, Marcus hired a small construction crew and quietly began installing a large chain link fence around the edge of his property. The fence wasn't just decorative, it extended across the main pathway that led directly to the HOA's head office and their private parking lot. By the time the HOA noticed, the fence was nearly complete. Karen stormed over one Saturday afternoon, hands on her hips, her voice sharp but still polite for the sake of appearances. "Marcus," she called out, "what exactly are you doing?" He turned to face her calmly. "I'm putting up a fence," he said simply. "It's my property. Perfectly within my rights." Her smile tightened. "You're blocking access to the HOA office." Marcus nodded. "Yes, I am. Because that path crosses my land. You know that?" I checked the maps. Karen's polite tone vanished. "You can't do this." "I can," Marcus replied evenly, holding up a copy of the property survey. "And I have. If you have a problem, take it up with my lawyer." For the first time, Marcus saw something flicker in Karen's expression, not anger, but uncertainty. By now, whispers had started spreading through Lakeshore Haven. Neighbors who once stayed silent began stopping by Marcus's cabin to ask questions, offer support, or share their own frustrations with the HOA. For years, everyone had been afraid to speak up. But seeing Marcus stand his ground gave them courage. And while Karen tried to act unfazed, Marcus could see the change in her demeanor. She was used to residents giving up quickly, but this time, things were different. This time, someone was fighting back. Marcus didn't know exactly how the next few months would unfold. There would be court dates, meetings, and plenty of challenges ahead. But one thing was certain, he wasn't backing down. He had the law on his side, the documents to prove it, and now, slowly but surely, the community was beginning to rally behind him. The dream cabin he once feared losing had become something much bigger, a symbol of standing up for what's right. And Marcus was ready for the battle ahead. Marcus woke up early on a bright Saturday morning, the sound of birdsong mixing with the quiet hum of the lake breeze. Normally, mornings like this were peaceful, but today, there was tension in the air. The fence he had built around his property was now the talk of the entire community. Over the past week, neighbors had stopped by to offer words of encouragement, while others quietly whispered about how brave Marcus was for standing up to the HOA. He appreciated the support, but he also knew this wasn't going to be easy. Karen and her board weren't used to being challenged, and they weren't going to back down without a fight. Sure enough, by late morning, Marcus saw Karen walking toward his cabin. She was dressed neatly, her HOA badge pinned proudly to her jacket, and behind her walked two board members carrying clipboards. "Good morning, Marcus," Karen said with a tight smile, her tone polite but firm. "We need to talk about that fence." Marcus stayed calm. "I believe everything about the fence is within my legal rights," he said evenly. "It's built entirely on my property." Karen glanced at the papers in her hand. "That's the problem," she replied smoothly. "This section of land isn't actually yours. The HOA has always maintained an easement here for office access." Marcus reached into his folder and handed her a copy of the property survey. "This map shows otherwise. The land is mine, including this pathway. I checked every record, Karen. Please review it carefully." For a moment, Karen's confident expression faltered. But she recovered quickly, giving a small laugh. "Marcus, these matters can't be solved by personal surveys. The HOA board will decide what's correct." Marcus shook his head slowly. "Not this time. I've already filed my case in county court. Any dispute about ownership will be handled there." The board members behind Karen exchanged surprised looks. Clearly, they hadn't expected Marcus to take legal action so quickly. Karen's smile faded. "You're making this much harder than it needs to be," she said softly. Marcus looked her straight in the eye. "No, Karen. I'm making it fair." That afternoon, Marcus called his attorney, Daniel, to update him on the confrontation. Daniel was pleased. "They're rattled," Daniel said confidently. "That's a good sign. If they were absolutely sure about their claims, they wouldn't be avoiding court." Daniel filed an emergency injunction to prevent the HOA from taking any action against Marcus's property until the legal dispute was resolved. That meant they couldn't fine him, couldn't restrict his access, and most importantly, couldn't force him to vacate. But Karen didn't give up easily. The next week, Marcus began receiving a flood of letters from the HOA. One claimed his porch light was too bright. Another accused him of having non-approved outdoor furniture. A third warned him about improperly planted shrubs. Every few days, there was a new letter, each one trying to create stress and pressure. Marcus carefully saved every single one. Whenever frustration crept in, he reminded himself of Daniel's words, "Paper trails don't lie." These letters, instead of intimidating him, were quietly building his case. A few evenings later, Marcus was sitting on his porch when Mr. Turner stopped by. "They're targeting you," Mr. Turner said in a low voice, glancing around nervously. "I've never seen them this aggressive before." Marcus nodded calmly. "I know. But I'm not scared." "You should know," Mr. Turner added, "word is spreading. People are starting to question Karen's leadership. More and more neighbors are siding with you." That piece of news gave Marcus hope. It wasn't just about his cabin anymore. This was about fairness for everyone in Lakeshore Haven. If Karen could do this to him, she could do it to anyone. The real turning point came 2 weeks later when Marcus received an unexpected knock at his door. It was a local news reporter. "Mr. Johnson," the reporter said, "we've received multiple complaints from residents about questionable practices by the Lakeshore Haven HOA. Would you be willing to share your story?" Marcus hesitated for a moment. He wasn't someone who liked attention, but then he thought about how many neighbors had quietly suffered under Karen's control. Maybe this was the push the community needed. "All right," Marcus agreed. "I'll talk." A week later, the story aired on the evening news. The segment highlighted Marcus's fight to keep his cabin, the HOA's questionable reassignment of properties, and the growing frustration among residents. Several neighbors, including Mr. Turner and Rachel, gave short interviews sharing their experiences. By the next day, Lakeshore Haven was buzzing. Some residents were shocked, others angry. A few longtime supporters of Karen defended her, but most people were quietly starting to see a different side of the HOA. Karen, however, was furious. She called an emergency HOA meeting the following evening, inviting all residents. Marcus attended, sitting quietly near the back while Karen stood at the podium. She began by calling the news story misleading and one-sided. She insisted the HOA was acting in the community's best interest and accused Marcus of spreading unnecessary fear. But this time, the room didn't stay silent. Rachel stood up first. "If you're acting in our best interest, why are so many of us afraid to speak up?" Then Mr. Turner added, "And why does your son always seem to benefit from these so-called boundary adjustments?" Murmurs spread through the crowd as more residents began voicing concerns. Karen tried to maintain control, but the tide was turning. For the first time, she was facing real opposition. The following week, the HOA board held a private meeting. When they emerged, word spread quickly, Karen was stepping down as HOA president. Officially, she cited personal reasons, but everyone knew the truth: the pressure had become too great. An interim board was appointed, and one of the first things they did was review Marcus's case. Within days, they issued an official statement: "After a thorough review, we confirm that Marcus Johnson is the rightful owner of his cabin and property. Any previous claims made by the HOA are invalid." Marcus had won. But while his personal victory was sweet, the larger change happening in Lakeshore Haven was even more meaningful. Neighbors began speaking openly about their frustrations, sharing stories they had once been too afraid to tell. The new board promised transparency, publishing meeting minutes and financial reports for everyone to see. For the first time since moving in, Marcus felt like Lakeshore Haven truly was a community. One evening, Rachel stopped by with homemade cookies and said, "You didn't just save your cabin, Marcus. You saved all of us." Marcus smiled softly. "I just wanted what was fair," he said. Yet, despite winning the legal battle, Marcus didn't feel any bitterness toward Karen. He had learned something important through all of this: power unchecked always leads to problems, and the only way to stop it is for someone to finally stand up. Sitting on his porch one quiet evening, watching the lake shimmer under the sunset, Marcus finally felt at peace again. The fear, the stress, the endless letters, all of it was behind him. His cabin was safe. And so was his community. The sun was slowly setting over Lakeshore Haven, casting a warm golden glow across the calm waters of the lake. Marcus sat on the porch of his cabin, a soft breeze carrying the scent of fresh pine and blooming azaleas. For the first time in months, his chest felt light, free from the constant weight of worry. The long battle with the HOA was finally over. It had taken months of paperwork, late-night research, endless meetings with his attorney, and a community-wide confrontation, but it was worth it. The official ruling had confirmed what Marcus always knew: the cabin was his, and no one had the right to take it from him. Still, the victory felt bigger than that. It wasn't just about keeping his property, it was about restoring fairness to a place he had once dreamed of calling home. In the weeks that followed Karen's resignation, Lakeshore Haven underwent a quiet but noticeable transformation. The new HOA board, now led by Ellen Parker, a longtime resident respected by many, worked quickly to repair the trust that had been broken. Ellen was calm, transparent, and genuinely cared about the community. Her very first act as interim president was to open up all HOA records to every homeowner. Meeting notes, budgets, decisions, everything was now available for review. "This is our community," Ellen said during her first public meeting, her voice steady but warm. "It belongs to all of us, not a select few." The crowd had erupted into applause. For years, many residents had felt powerless, bound by strict rules they didn't fully understand and afraid to question leadership. But now, things were different. People were beginning to speak openly, suggesting ideas and working together to improve the neighborhood. A sense of togetherness slowly replaced the tension that had hung over the community for so long. Marcus became something of an unexpected figure in this change. He wasn't loud or attention-seeking, but neighbors frequently stopped by his cabin to thank him. Some brought cookies, others left handwritten notes. A few even shared stories of their own struggles with the old HOA, stories they had kept quiet for years out of fear of retaliation. One afternoon, Rachel, the young mother from down the street, visited with her son. "You know," she said softly, "before all this, I was thinking about selling my house. I felt trapped. But seeing you stand up changed everything for me." Marcus smiled modestly. "I didn't do it alone," he replied. "All of us played a part." Rachel shook her head. "Maybe. But you were the first to take a step. You reminded us that we have a voice." Her words stayed with Marcus for a long time. Life around the cabin slowly returned to normal and, in some ways, became even better than before. Mornings were peaceful again. Marcus would sip his coffee on the porch, listening to birds chirping and watching sunlight ripple across the water. The lake, once a symbol of uncertainty and fear, now felt like home again. On weekends, neighbors began gathering for small community events. There were fishing contests, outdoor movie nights by the lake, and barbecues where everyone pitched in. It was during one such gathering that Marcus noticed something he hadn't seen before: smiles everywhere. People were relaxed, laughing freely, enjoying their homes without the constant shadow of strict control. Even simple things, like choosing their own porch decorations or planting flowers of any color, suddenly felt like acts of quiet freedom. Karen and Chad, meanwhile, had moved away quietly. There were no farewells, no explanations. Most residents chose not to dwell on it. Lakeshore Haven was looking forward, not backward. For Marcus, though, the experience left behind lessons he would never forget. He had learned how easily power could be misused when no one questioned it. He had seen firsthand how silence allowed unfairness to grow unchecked. And he had discovered just how much one determined person could achieve when they refused to back down. Sometimes, he thought as he watched the lake shimmer under the sunset, change begins when someone simply says, "Enough." Months later, Marcus was invited to speak at a local community forum about homeowners' rights. At first, he hesitated. Public speaking wasn't something he enjoyed. But Daniel, his attorney, encouraged him. "You've been through something a lot of people are afraid to face," Daniel said. "Your story could help others." So, Marcus agreed. Standing in front of a small crowd at the community center, he shared his experience. He talked about the shock of receiving the reassignment letter, the frustration of unanswered calls, the nights spent gathering evidence, and the courage it took to stand up to something bigger than himself. But he also talked about the importance of unity. "If there's one thing I've learned," Marcus said, "it's that we're stronger when we stand together. Change doesn't happen because one person fights alone, it happens when a community decides it deserves better." The audience listened closely, and afterward, several people approached him to thank him. Some were dealing with their own HOA issues and felt inspired to take action. Marcus realized something important that day: his fight had a ripple effect far beyond his cabin. Back at Lakeshore Haven, things continued to improve under Ellen's leadership. HOA policies were rewritten with input from residents, making them fair and transparent. Everyone now had a say in decisions affecting their homes. The once tense, divided community had become something different, something better. And Marcus, though he never sought recognition, became a quiet symbol of resilience. One evening, while walking along the lake, Mr. Turner caught up with him. The elderly man smiled warmly and said, "You know, Marcus, when you built that fence, I thought you were just protecting your property. Turns out, you were protecting all of us." Marcus laughed softly. "I just wanted to keep my cabin," he replied. "Maybe," Mr. Turner said thoughtfully, "but sometimes standing up for yourself ends up helping everyone else too." As time passed, Marcus spent more weekends enjoying the little things he had once feared losing. He'd sit on his dock, casting a fishing line into the still water, or invite friends over for quiet dinners by the fire. Every now and then, he would glance at the sturdy fence surrounding his property, a reminder of everything he had been through. But instead of seeing it as a barrier, he now saw it as a symbol. A symbol of standing firm. A symbol of fairness. A symbol of hope. One spring morning, as Marcus sat with a notebook on his porch, he decided to write down his story, not for attention, but as a guide for others who might face similar challenges. He titled it simply, "Stand Your Ground, One Homeowner's Journey." He wrote about every step, from the first letter he received to the final court ruling, sharing the lessons he had learned along the way. Weeks later, when he posted it online, he was surprised to receive dozens of messages from people across the country thanking him. Some were in situations almost identical to his, and they found strength in knowing they weren't alone. In helping himself, Marcus had unknowingly helped countless others. One evening, as he watched the sun disappear behind the tall pines, Marcus reflected on everything that had happened. He thought about the fear, the frustration, the countless nights spent wondering if he would lose everything. He thought about the neighbors who had quietly suffered before, too afraid to speak up. He thought about the fence, the court hearings, the news stories, and the way the community had come together in the end. Most of all, he thought about how close he had come to giving up. If he had walked away quietly, nothing would have changed. Instead, he chose to fight. And because of that, Lakeshore Haven was no longer a place of fear, it was a place of belonging. Marcus smiled as the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky. He had his cabin. He had his peace back. But more than that, he had something even better, a community that finally stood together. Sometimes, victories aren't loud. They don't always come with celebrations or parades. Sometimes, they're quiet, like a calm evening by the lake, where everything finally feels right again. For Marcus, that was more than enough.